Hello. My name is Houston, and this is Media Mood Board. Yes, my name is Houston. This is Media Mood Board, a show about hyper-specific entertainment lists. It's the middle of October, and I've only really watched 2 scary movies. I feel like I haven't read too many scary books. If I've read any, maybe just Frankenstein. So I know more about horror movies than I do books, and most of my knowledge of horror movies is modern, or things that have modern influences. So I was interested in taking it back before the earliest things that I could think of, like a Frankenstein, to what horror looked like before that. So today we're going over horror novellas before 1900. My goal for myself is I've curated a selection of novellas from before 1900 to try and read over the next 2 weeks, and then I'll come back and report on them. There's a bunch of novels that were interesting too, but for this I wanted to kind of get a snapshot of the era, so I decided not to do things that were like 700 pages. One thing that I found is that after kind of ghost stories, Gothic literature was kind of the mainstay of early horror. I'm going to be using my phone because I've taken notes on these and I don't have them all memorized. We're just going to go in chronological order from the earliest to the most recent one. We're going to be starting in 1764 with what is regarded as the first Gothic story. It's called The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. He was this aristocratic guy that really loved like Gothic architecture and was obsessed with it. He had like this big place built, as far as I understand. And the impetus of this story came to him in a dream where he woke up from a nightmare where at the top of his Gothic manor, there was this giant hand in armor. It tells a story about a family who lives in this mansion. The son dies and there seems to be some ancient prophecy that's being fulfilled, and the father is kind of nervous that it's going to happen. From what I understand, this is regarded as the first Gothic long-form story. It's about 150 pages, so I'll be interested to see how something as far back as the 1700s, which honestly I'm not super familiar with the time period and its kind of historical surroundings, which I will look into after I read. But I'm excited to see what this entry point into the Gothic genre, where it starts out. And then we're moving on just a couple of years later, 1773. I wanted to show some representations for poetry in this. There's also a group of poets around this time called the Graveyard Poets who, hold on, I just want to read the exact quote. The Graveyard Poets were a number of pre-romantic poets of the 18th century, characterized by their gloomy meditations on mortality, skulls, coffins, epitaphs, and worms. That felt in the spirit, but I'm not going to be reading anything from them. What I will be reading is this poem called Léonore, written by Gottfried Berger from Germany. This is a ballad that super influenced a lot of writing afterwards. It's cited as something that is highly influential on like romantic writing. It's a ballad about our main character. Her husband has gone off to war and has not come back, and she assumes that he's dead. A person who looks just like him shows up one night on this horse and asks her to go on a ride around the town. And there's supernatural elements to it, of course. I'm not too familiar with like straight narrative poetry. I mean, like I read like Beowulf in high school or whatever, especially since most Gothic stuff I think is like painterly. I'm interested to see how poetry makes its way into this. We're really jumping forward on this one to 1834. A lot of the Gothic writing was focused in Britain, but I wanted to make sure that I was showing things from a lot of different countries. This one's from Russia. It's by Pushkin. It's called The Queen of Spades, which honestly, it kind of has similarities to that Henry Sugar story that Benedict Cumberbatch was recently in an adaptation of. But it's a supernatural story about a card player who can somehow always seem to win, and someone trying to figure out how that can happen so that they can use it to their advantage. I've read some of Pushkin's other stuff before. I didn't know he wrote like a supernatural story, so I'm interested in seeing what this looks like, especially since it's a little bit forward in time, and also to see how that Russian perspective kind of differs from the German as well as the earlier British. And then we're jumping a couple years later to a person I read again in high school, but don't know that much about as an adult. Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of House Usher was released just a couple years later in 1839 and is another spooky house story. The Castle of Otranto seems to be the story about a house and how the people are connected to it kind of as if it's another being in their ecosystem. Edgar Allan Poe is a very influential writer, obviously. I'm not that familiar with his work, but I'm interested in comparing and contrasting this with the earlier work from 1776 because they seem to be playing with similar themes about like the main character is kind of this house. And Fall of House of Usher, the general premise is that it's just about this guy who goes to visit his childhood friend's home, and it's really gloomy and seems to be infected by some sort of evil spirit or something. We're jumping ahead again to 1872, and we're going to be reading Carmilla. This is a story about a woman who's being seduced by this lesbian vampire. It predates Dracula by, I think, like 20 years or something like that. It's kind of framed around this occult detective who's looking into it. All these things sound very, very cool. Really interested in kind of the detective aspect of it. The other ones sound more like moody pieces. This sounds like it maybe has a little bit more human connection to it rather than scene painting. So I'm interested in... This one just sounds fun. Because all of my vampire stuff is Dracula or reactions to Dracula, I'm interested in seeing how a pre-Dracula approach looks. We're following that with 1892's The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Gilman. This is an example of psychological horror. It's a short story about this person whose husband's basically like, hey, you're in hysterics, you need to just stay inside and get better, and you're not allowed to do anything that would exert yourself. And it's about her slowly going mad in this house. So it still has the house theme, and all these other ones are psychological too, but this one seems to be more of character study rather than a house study, but we'll see. And we're finishing things off in 1898, very close to 1900, with Henry James' The Turn of the Screw. This is a story about a governess who comes to take care of these kids and thinks there's supernatural things happening. There's almost nothing more gothic that I can think of than like a governess and ghosts. I'm interested in this one, especially leading up to this, to see what trends stay around or what similarities there are, or just how it's approached differently than all of the other kind of gothic and spooky stories that we'll be reading up to this. In a 200-year span, there's obviously a lot of other really cool things to choose from. So before we finish the video, I just want to go over some of the ones that I decided not to curate for this list. I've got my little haul of what I'm reading. I thought that, they're easy to find online, but I figured, you know what? Especially for like reading an older time period, I want to read it in a book form. Just the physicality of it. They have really cool covers. Let's go through all the books that I ended up rejecting from this list. I wanted to represent a bunch of different types of the world, since Gothic literature was mostly out of Britain. And one that I considered was this Japanese collection of short stories from the 1700s called Ugetsu Monogatari, The Tales of Moonlight and Rain. I ended up cutting this one because I had so many others to read already, and I thought I had a pretty cohesive picture of what I was trying to do. But I may end up reading some of these later. There are a lot of women writers who were doing kind of Gothic literature at the time, so I wanted to make sure they were represented. Two of the ones that did not end up making the list were 1777's The Old English Baron by Clara Reed, and The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. The Mysteries of Udolpho got like a lot of praise, but it's like almost 700 pages. So, that'll take me a year to read. So the next one is one that I was excited to read, but then the length just doesn't fit in the time frame. It's called The Monk. It's from the late 1700s, and it's just about a monk who is tempted by this demon and kind of that whole saga. It's about 400, 500 pages. Written in the late 1700s, so that's, wow, okay, what's the story? Northanger Abbey, obviously, by Jane Austen. This is kind of her parody of Gothic literature. It's also almost 300 pages, one of the reasons I didn't choose it, but I didn't want to jump into parody until I actually understood the genre better, so I eliminated that one. The next one is The Vampyre. It was written during the same kind of like bet that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein during. One of those stories that they all wrote is kind of like just a quick exercise. So another early vampire story. I also considered Frankenstein, which I loved when I read it back in high school. I would probably still love it now. It also fits within my novella range. It's only like 130 pages. But I looked at everything else and ultimately decided to cut this one. 1836 is The Amber Witch, just a witch trial story from the era, which I thought was interesting. Woman in White looked really cool. It's a story about this guy who incarnates this person who he may not be a ghost or if someone who's escaped from an asylum. The Woman in White is almost 700 pages. Even though it sounded atmospheric and cool, it's like, 700 pages. And chronologically, the one closest to 1900 that I didn't end up including was Lady Audley's Secret. It's a thriller written in 1862 by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. It's a domestic thriller about this family life and this mysterious kind of murder. Maybe the governess is involved. It just sounded super fun. Well, you made it. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, You can subscribe here on YouTube or follow us on Letterboxd. We'll be back next week with another hyper-specific entertainment list. My name's Houston. This is Media Mood Board. Bye.